In the final years of World War II, Europe had already become a continent of ruins. Entire cities were erased from the map, millions had vanished into mass graves, and soldiers on every front had stopped fighting for victory and started fighting simply to survive another night. But even among the endless horrors of the war, there were massacres so brutal, so chaotic, and so politically inconvenient that history itself seemed to bury them. Not because they were small, but because nobody wanted to remember them. In January of 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed from every direction, civilians across Eastern Europe found themselves trapped between two unstoppable forces: a dying Reich consumed by paranoia, and a Soviet army advancing westward with unimaginable rage after years of devastation on the Eastern Front. Villages disappeared overnight. Entire families fled through frozen forests carrying whatever they could hold in their arms. Refugee columns stretched for miles across snow-covered roads while artillery thundered somewhere beyond the horizon. Nobody knew who would arrive first: German deserters, Soviet tanks, SS patrols, hunger, or death itself. And in the middle of that chaos, one massacre unfolded with such violence and confusion that survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what truly happened. Thousands of civilians, most of them women, children, and elderly refugees, became trapped inside a small coastal town on the Baltic Sea while war collapsed around them. Bombs fell from the sky. Panic spread through the streets. Soldiers abandoned their positions. Families were crushed against frozen harbor walls trying to escape aboard overloaded ships. And when Soviet forces finally entered the city, what followed would become one of the most horrifying forgotten tragedies of the entire war. For decades, almost nobody outside the region spoke about it. The Cold War buried the story beneath politics. Germany wanted to move on from the war. The Soviet Union had no interest in discussing civilian suffering during its advance westward. Survivors remained silent, either from trauma or fear. But the massacre never truly disappeared. It survived in fragmented testimonies, hidden diaries, burned photographs, and the memories of those who escaped the nightmare by pure luck. Because what happened there was more than just another battle. It was the moment an entire world collapsed at once. And for the people trapped inside it, World War II did not end with liberation. It ended with fire, ice, screams, and blood in the snow. The city filled with refugees. By early 1945, the Eastern Front no longer looked like a war. It looked like the end of civilization itself. After years of brutal fighting, the Soviet Red Army was now advancing into German territory with unstoppable momentum. Entire Wehrmacht divisions had ceased to exist. Supply lines collapsed. Communication disappeared. Officers lost control over retreating soldiers who wandered frozen roads like ghosts. The German state was disintegrating from the inside, but Adolf Hitler continued issuing impossible orders from Berlin, demanding cities be defended to the last man. And trapped beneath all of it were civilians who had nowhere left to run. One of those places was the Baltic coastal city of Königsberg and the surrounding refugee routes stretching toward the ports of East Prussia. As Soviet troops pushed westward, hundreds of thousands of German civilians fled their homes in terror. They had heard the stories coming from the east for months now. Villages burned, executions, assaults, revenge killings. Entire communities erased during the Soviet advance after years of Nazi atrocities inside Soviet territory. Fear spread faster than the army itself. Families abandoned farms overnight, loading children into carts pulled through snowstorms while temperatures dropped below freezing. Some froze to death along the roads before even seeing a Soviet soldier. The refugee columns became endless. Mothers carrying infants wrapped in blankets, elderly men collapsing beside frozen ditches, horses dying from exhaustion while artillery flashes illuminated the distant sky. Nobody knew exactly where safety existed anymore. Rumors spread constantly through the crowds. The Soviets are only 10 kilometers away. The port is still evacuating civilians. The Navy is sending ships. The roads are blocked. Every direction carried the possibility of survival or massacre. As panic intensified, civilians flooded toward the Baltic ports, especially places connected to what became one of the largest maritime evacuations in history, Operation Hannibal. German naval commanders understood the scale of the collapse unfolding in the east. Millions of refugees were now attempting to escape through the frozen Baltic Sea, while Soviet forces closed in from every direction. Passenger liners, military transports, fishing boats, cargo vessels, anything capable of floating was suddenly transformed into an evacuation ship. But the ports themselves quickly descended into chaos. Cities that once held tens of thousands now held hundreds of thousands. Streets became overcrowded with refugees sleeping inside churches, warehouses, schools, train stations, and ruined buildings. Food supplies disappeared almost immediately. Disease spread through the masses. Children cried through the night while distant artillery thundered closer every day. Luftwaffe aircraft barely existed anymore. German soldiers stationed near the ports often looked just as terrified as the civilians they were supposed to protect. And then came the bombings. Soviet aircraft began attacking evacuation zones and transportation routes relentlessly. Explosions tore through refugee columns already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Frozen roads became littered with destroyed wagons, dead horses, abandoned luggage, and bodies half covered by snowdrifts. Survivors later described hearing children screaming beneath collapsed carts while people kept running because stopping meant death. Entire families vanished within seconds beneath artillery fire. But the worst horror came at the harbors themselves. As word spread that ships were still evacuating civilians across the Baltic Sea, desperate crowds surged toward the docks in uncontrollable waves. Thousands pushed against military checkpoints begging for passage. Women held children above their heads screaming for sailors to take them. Elderly refugees collapsed from exhaustion before ever reaching the boarding lines. German officers tried maintaining order, but discipline had already broken apart. Some soldiers abandoned their posts completely, blending into the civilian crowds to escape for themselves. And then the ships began leaving overloaded far beyond capacity. One vessel designed for a few thousand passengers now carried 10,000. Another departed with refugees packed shoulder to shoulder inside freezing cargo compartments. Many passengers had no food, no blankets, and no idea where the ships were even going. They only knew staying behind meant facing the Soviet advance. Among those ships was the infamous Wilhelm Gustloff. The night the Baltic Sea became a graveyard. By February 1945, the evacuation across the Baltic Sea had transformed into a floating apocalypse. The German Reich was collapsing faster every week, and now millions of civilians, wounded soldiers, and retreating military personnel were desperately attempting to escape westward before Soviet forces sealed the coastline completely. Entire ports had become scenes of hysteria. Refugees no longer traveled as organized groups. They moved like human floods, driven only by fear. Every rumor of an arriving ship caused immediate chaos. Every distant artillery impact sent crowds running through the streets. And every day, the Soviet front moved closer. The worst part was that nobody truly understood what was happening anymore. German propaganda still claimed victory was possible. Radio broadcasts continued speaking about miracle weapons and counteroffensives while civilians watched burned soldiers stumble through refugee camps with empty eyes. Officers barked orders nobody obeyed. Military police tried restoring discipline, but the state itself was dying in real time. Entire units vanished during retreats. Some soldiers discarded uniforms and blended into refugee columns. Others became more dangerous than the enemy itself, stealing food, wagons, and winter clothing from civilians just to survive another night. And above all of it lingered one terrifying belief shared by almost everyone fleeing westward. If the Soviet army reached them first, there would be no mercy. Stories from East Prussia spread through the refugee camps like nightmares whispered beside fires. Villages where civilians had disappeared completely. Women assaulted and murdered inside burned homes. Elderly people executed along frozen roads. Children separated from families during artillery bombardments and never found again. Some stories were exaggerated by panic and propaganda. Others were horrifyingly real. But by that point, truth barely mattered anymore. Fear had already consumed the population completely. Inside the Baltic ports, conditions became almost impossible to survive. Thousands slept outdoors in sub-zero temperatures because every building was already overcrowded. Food distribution collapsed under the pressure of endless arrivals. Mothers traded jewelry for pieces of bread. Sick refugees froze to death overnight against harbor walls while naval officers prioritized military evacuations. Corpses sometimes remained lying beside the docks for hours because nobody had time or strength left to move them. Witnesses later described the smell of smoke, seawater, blood, and human waste mixing together beneath the freezing winter air. Then came another disaster. On February 10, 1945, the German transport ship SS General von Steuben departed carrying thousands of wounded soldiers, civilians, and refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. The ship moved slowly through the dark Baltic waters under freezing conditions, overloaded like every other evacuation vessel during those final months of the war. Many passengers believed they had finally escaped the nightmare unfolding on land. But Soviet submarines still hunted the evacuation routes relentlessly. Late that night, torpedoes slammed into the ship without warning. The explosions tore through the vessel instantly. Panic erupted in total darkness as freezing water flooded the lower compartments. Wounded soldiers trapped inside hospital areas drowned where they lay. Civilians rushed toward the decks, crushing each other in stairwells while sailors attempted launching lifeboats in impossible conditions. Some survivors later recalled hearing screaming from beneath the ship long after it began sinking. Others described watching entire families disappear beneath black water, illuminated only by emergency lights and distant fires. Within minutes, thousands were dead, and the sea kept swallowing more. Only days later, another evacuation vessel, the SS Goya, suffered an even worse fate. Packed with refugees and retreating personnel far beyond its intended capacity, the ship was struck by Soviet torpedoes during the night. Witnesses later described one of the most horrifying sinkings of the entire war. The vessel reportedly went down within minutes, giving passengers almost no time to escape. Thousands became trapped below deck instantly. Others leaped into freezing water where survival lasted only minutes before hypothermia shut down the body completely. The Baltic Sea itself had become a mass grave. Not for soldiers alone, but for civilians trying to escape the destruction-consuming Europe. Children, pregnant women, entire families, old men who had survived one world war only to die in another. The war was nearing its end. Allied forces were entering Germany from the west. Concentration camps were beginning to be liberated. The scale of Nazi crimes was becoming visible to the entire planet. Against that unimaginable backdrop of industrial genocide, the suffering of fleeing German civilians became politically uncomfortable to discuss. Sympathy risked appearing like forgiveness. And so many of these tragedies faded into silence, almost immediately after the war ended. But for survivors, the memories never disappeared. Decades later, eyewitnesses still described the sound of the Baltic at night with absolute terror. The screams in freezing darkness, mothers begging sailors to save their children first, bodies floating across black water beneath snowstorms, the feeling of watching entire ships vanish into the sea while survivors clung to debris that froze their hands solid within minutes. One survivor later recalled seeing so many dead bodies floating beside the harbor after a sinking that the water itself barely seemed visible anymore. Another described hearing children crying from beneath overturned lifeboats trapped in ice. Others never spoke about what they saw ever again, because the final months of World War II were not simply battles between armies anymore. They were the collapse of entire human worlds. Civilization itself had broken apart. The German state no longer functioned. Soviet forces advanced with overwhelming fury after enduring years of Nazi extermination campaigns inside their homeland. Millions of civilians fled blindly across roads already destroyed by war. Hunger consumed entire refugee populations. Disease spread through overcrowded ports. Ships departed overloaded because leaving people behind guaranteed death. And in the middle of this unimaginable catastrophe, ordinary civilians became trapped inside one of the deadliest humanitarian disasters in modern history. Historians still debate how these events should be remembered. Some argue the suffering of German civilians was an inevitable consequence of a war started by Nazi Germany itself. Others insist civilian suffering must be acknowledged regardless of politics or national guilt. But beyond all historical arguments lies a simpler reality. Most of the people dying in those freezing waters were not politicians. They were terrified human beings trying to survive the end of the world around them. And when the war finally ended months later, Europe emerged victorious, but traumatized beyond recognition. Entire cities no longer existed. Millions were dead. Millions more had vanished. And beneath the cold waters of the Baltic Sea, countless bodies remained trapped forever in darkness, silent reminders of a massacre history almost forgot.